He's celebrating our divorce with his secretary tonight at the Ritz-Carlton. But what he doesn't know is that my lawyer just confirmed I own 75% of his construction empire. 8 years of military service taught me about strategic planning, and 12 years of marriage to Richard Blackwell taught me everything about his business vulnerabilities. Tonight, while he thinks he's finally free to start his new life, I'm about to show him what happens when you underestimate a decorated Army logistics officer who's been quietly building her own war chest. The champagne bottles are probably already chilled in their suite. Miranda Walsh, his 28-year-old marketing coordinator turned mistress, is likely slipping into that red dress she bought last week on the company credit card. Richard is probably practicing his victory speech in the mirror, the same way he rehearsed his closing arguments when he was still pretending to be a small-town lawyer before my father's construction company made him rich. They think tonight marks the beginning of their fairy tale romance, built on the ashes of our marriage and my apparent naivety. What they don't realize is that while Richard was planning his grand escape, I was executing the most complex acquisition strategy of my career. The same skills that helped me coordinate supply chains across 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan became the foundation for systematically gaining control of Blackwell Construction Group. Every late night he spent with Miranda, every weekend business trip that wasn't really business, every family dinner he missed while claiming urgent client meetings, I was using those hours to study corporate law, financial structures, and the intricate web of partnerships that held his empire together. My name is Captain Sarah Mitchell Blackwell, though after tonight I'll be going back to just Sarah Mitchell. I spent 8 years in the Army, rising from enlisted logistics specialist to commissioned officer, managing multi-million-dollar supply operations in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. I coordinated food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies for forward operating bases that kept thousands of soldiers alive and mission-ready. I thought those skills would translate perfectly to civilian life, to building something meaningful with the man I loved. I met Richard during my first month of terminal leave, when I was transitioning out of the military and trying to figure out what came next. I'd chosen to settle in Millbrook, Colorado, a growing mountain town where my father's small construction business had been struggling to compete with larger Denver-based companies. Richard had just passed the bar exam and was working for a local firm that handled real estate transactions and small business disputes. He was charming, ambitious, and genuinely seemed to admire my military background rather than be intimidated by it. The courtship was everything a recently discharged soldier could hope for. Richard would pick me up in his modest Honda Civic for dinner at family-owned restaurants where he'd ask detailed questions about military logistics and expressed genuine fascination with the complexity of coordinating global supply chains. He seemed impressed by my organizational skills, my attention to detail, and my ability to remain calm under pressure. When I'd share stories about managing crisis situations in combat zones, he'd shake his head in amazement and tell me I was the strongest person he'd ever met. My father, Frank Mitchell, was skeptical at first. 3 generations of Mitchell men had built Mitchell Construction from a one-truck operation into a respected local company specializing in custom homes and small commercial projects. Dad had always assumed I'd eventually take over the business, applying my military expertise to help expand operations. When I announced I was marrying Richard instead of immediately joining the company, Dad's disappointment was obvious, though he tried to hide it behind congratulations and wedding planning enthusiasm. The proposal came 8 months after we met, during a hiking trip to Crystal Lake. Richard had planned every detail meticulously, from the timing that would place us at the scenic overlook during golden hour to the photographer hidden among the trees to capture the moment. The ring was beautiful, but modest, exactly what a young attorney could afford on his starting salary. When I said yes, I genuinely believed I was choosing love over legacy, partnership over profit, and a future built on mutual respect rather than inherited obligation. The early years of our marriage were everything I'd hoped for. Richard supported My decision to complete my bachelor's degree in business administration using my GI Bill benefits, even when it meant I'd be studying while he was trying to build his legal practice. We lived in a small apartment above the hardware store downtown, splitting rent and groceries, celebrating small victories like Richard's first major client or my perfect score on a particularly challenging economics exam. The transformation began, gradually, so subtly that I didn't recognize it as a systematic campaign to remake me, according to Richard's evolving vision of success. It started with small suggestions about my appearance, my speaking style, my social interactions. Richard would offer gentle corrections when I used military terminology in civilian settings, explaining that it made people uncomfortable. He'd suggest different outfits for law firm social events, claiming he wanted me to make the best impression on potential clients and partners. When my father suffered his heart attack during our 3rd year of marriage, I wanted to take over Mitchell Construction immediately. Dad was only 55, but the stress of trying to compete with larger companies while maintaining quality standards had been slowly destroying his health. The business needed fresh leadership, new strategies, and the kind of systematic reorganization that I'd been training for my entire military career. Richard convinced me to wait. He argued that jumping into the construction business without proper preparation would be unfair to my father's legacy and potentially disastrous for our personal finances. Instead, he suggested I continue my education, perhaps pursue an MBA, while he helped Dad modernize the business from a legal perspective. Richard would handle the corporate restructuring, contract negotiations, and strategic partnerships while I gained the academic credentials that would make me a more effective leader eventually. It seemed logical, even generous. Richard was offering to use his legal expertise to help my family's business while supporting my educational goals. He presented it as a partnership where we'd both contribute our skills toward a common objective. What I didn't understand then was that Richard was positioning himself to control Mitchell Construction while systematically removing me from operational decisions. The legal restructuring Richard implemented was brilliant in its complexity and devastating in its implications. He convinced my father to establish Mitchell Construction Group as a holding company with multiple subsidiary LLCs handling different aspects of the business. Each subsidiary required specialized legal documentation, regulatory compliance, and partnership agreements that were far beyond my father's understanding. Richard became the architect of these arrangements, drafting contracts and establishing corporate structures that gave him increasing influence over daily operations. Meanwhile, I was buried in MBA coursework, studying financial management and strategic planning while Richard assured me he was simply maintaining the business until I was ready to take control. He'd provide regular updates during our dinner conversations, explaining complex legal maneuvering in terms that emphasized his indispensability and my father's growing dependence on professional expertise. Every month, the business seemed to require more sophisticated legal work, more complicated partnership arrangements, more regulatory compliance that only Richard could navigate. The expansion came in our 5th year of marriage. Richard had identified several struggling smaller companies that Mitchell Construction could acquire, combining their assets and client lists with Dad's established reputation for quality work. The acquisitions required significant capital investment, complex financing arrangements, and legal structures that were far beyond my father's comfort zone. Richard presented himself as the solution to these challenges, offering to manage all legal aspects of the expansion in exchange for a minority partnership stake in the restructured company. My father, exhausted by years of stress and still recovering from his health scare, gratefully accepted Richard's offer. The partnership agreement gave Richard 25% ownership of Mitchell Construction Group in exchange for his legal services and ongoing management responsibilities. I thought it was a generous deal that would allow Dad to step back from daily operations while ensuring the business continued to grow under experienced leadership. What I didn't understand was that Richard had been carefully documenting every aspect of my father's business operations for years, identifying inefficiencies, profit opportunities, and strategic advantages that could be exploited through systematic reorganization. The partnership agreement wasn't just payment for legal services. It was the foundation for a hostile takeover disguised as family cooperation. Within 18 months of becoming a partner, Richard had restructured the company so thoroughly that my father was essentially a minority shareholder in his own business. The original Mitchell Construction became just one subsidiary of a larger holding company that included equipment leasing, property development, subcontracting services, and construction management divisions. Each division was legally separate, financially independent, and managed through complex partnership agreements that gave Richard operational control while my father retained only nominal ownership. Richard explained these changes as necessary modernization that would protect the business from liability and maximize profit opportunities. He'd show me financial statements that demonstrated impressive growth, expansion into new markets, and improved operational efficiency. When I expressed concern about my father's diminishing role in the company he'd built, Richard would patiently explain that modern construction businesses required professional management expertise that went far beyond traditional contracting skills. The truth was that Richard had systematically stripped my father of control over his own company while making it appear as if he was simply providing professional services. Every contract negotiation, every expansion decision, every strategic partnership was structured to increase Richard's influence while diminishing my father's autonomy. By our 7th year of marriage, Richard Blackwell had effectively become the CEO of what was once Mitchell Construction, while my father had been relegated to the role of silent partner in his own life's work, and I was completing my MBA, believing that I was preparing to eventually take over a thriving family business that would benefit from my military training and academic credentials. I had no idea that Richard was systematically eliminating any possibility of my meaningful involvement in the company while maintaining the illusion that everything was being preserved for my eventual leadership. The affair with Miranda Walsh began during our 10th year of marriage, though I wouldn't discover it until 2 years later. Miranda had been hired as a marketing coordinator for the construction group's new commercial development division, a young graduate from Colorado State with an impressive portfolio of social media campaigns and brand management experience. Richard presented her hiring as a strategic investment in modernizing the company's marketing approach, reaching younger demographics, and establishing a professional image that would attract higher-end clients. Miranda was everything I wasn't. She was young, energetic, social media savvy, and completely unthreatened by Richard's legal expertise or business acumen. She would laugh at his jokes with genuine appreciation, ask admiringly about his strategic vision for the company, and treat him like the brilliant executive he'd always wanted to be seen as. Where I brought military discipline and analytical thinking to every conversation, Miranda brought enthusiasm and uncomplicated admiration. The signs were there, but I missed them completely. Richard began working later hours, traveling more frequently for business development meetings, and spending weekends at the office reviewing marketing materials and social media strategies. He'd come home energized by these work sessions, excited about new branding opportunities and expansion possibilities that Miranda had identified. He seemed more engaged with the business than he'd been in years, more optimistic about future growth, more satisfied with his professional achievements. What I interpreted as a renewed dedication to our shared goals was actually the beginning of Richard's systematic preparation for my elimination from his life. Every late night with Miranda, every weekend marketing session, every business trip to explore new markets was simultaneously an affair and a strategic planning session for our divorce. They weren't just falling in love, they were designing the corporate and personal structures that would allow them to be together while minimizing my ability to interfere with their plans. The discovery came through something mundane and completely accidental. I was looking for our insurance documents after a minor fender bender, searching through Richard's home office filing cabinet for the automotive policy paperwork. Richard had always been meticulously organized, keeping every document properly filed and easily accessible. I found the insurance folder quickly, but while returning it to its proper place, I knocked over a small stack of papers that had been sitting on top of the filing cabinet. Among the scattered documents was a hotel receipt from the Four Seasons, in Denver, dated 3 weeks earlier, for a room registered under the names Mr. and Mrs. R. Blackwell. The problem was that I'd been in Colorado Springs that weekend, attending a veterans conference, while Richard had supposedly been in meetings with potential investors. The receipt showed charges for room service, spa treatments, and champagne that painted a picture of a romantic getaway rather than a business trip. That single piece of paper unlocked 12 years of carefully maintained suspicions that I'd been unconsciously cataloging and dismissing. Every unexplained expense, every inconsistent travel story, every enthusiastic description of Miranda's professional contributions suddenly aligned into a pattern that was impossible to ignore. My husband wasn't just having an affair. He'd been building an alternative life that was designed to replace me entirely. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Richard's betrayal. Using the same systematic approach I'd applied to military logistics, I began documenting every suspicious transaction, every unexplained absence, every business decision that seemed designed to exclude me from meaningful participation in what had once been my family's company. What I discovered was a 2-year campaign to position Miranda as my replacement in both Richard's personal life and professional future, while simultaneously eliminating my legal and financial claims to the business empire he'd built using my father's company as the foundation. The divorce papers he planned to serve tonight were just the final step in a process that had been underway for years. Richard had been systematically preparing for this moment, confident that his legal expertise and financial resources would allow him to discard me while keeping everything he'd acquired through our marriage. He'd calculated every angle, prepared for every contingency, and positioned himself for a clean break that would leave me with minimal assets and no ongoing connection to the business I'd expected to inherit. But Richard had made one critical error in his planning. He'd spent so much time focusing on legal structures and financial maneuvering that he'd forgotten the most important lesson from my military service. Always gather intelligence on your adversary's position before you reveal your own intentions. While he was planning my elimination, I was quietly gathering intelligence on his vulnerabilities. And what I discovered was going to destroy everything he thought he'd built. The transformation of Richard from small-town attorney to construction empire CEO hadn't happened overnight, and understanding that evolution was crucial to appreciating just how completely he'd underestimated what he was up against. When we first met, Richard Blackwell was genuinely humble, driving that modest Honda Civic and sharing studio apartment rent with a law school classmate who worked as a paralegal downtown. He'd grown up in Grand Junction, the son of an insurance salesman and a substitute teacher, solidly middle class but without any of the generational wealth that creates automatic social confidence. Richard's ambition was immediately apparent, but it seemed healthy and admirable rather than predatory. He'd worked his way through law school with a combination of student loans, part-time jobs, and academic scholarships that required maintaining a near-perfect GPA. His specialty was business law, with a particular focus on small business operations and real estate transactions. When he talked about his career goals, he spoke about helping local entrepreneurs navigate legal complexities that could destroy their dreams if handled incorrectly. My military background fascinated him in those early days, not because he wanted to use it, but because he genuinely respected the discipline and strategic thinking it represented. Richard would ask detailed questions about logistics operations, supply chain management, and crisis response protocols with the curiosity of someone trying to understand how complex systems functioned under pressure. He seemed to genuinely admire my ability to remain calm during emergencies, to think systematically about resource allocation, and to coordinate multiple moving parts toward a common objective. The physical attraction between us was immediate and obvious, but what made our relationship special was the intellectual connection. Richard was one of the few civilian men I'd met who didn't seem intimidated by my military rank or uncomfortable with my leadership experience. He'd listen to stories about managing personnel conflicts in combat zones or coordinating equipment, deliveries under enemy fire with the same attention he brought to studying case law. When I'd describe the complexity of keeping a forward operating base supplied and functional, he'd nod with understanding and ask follow-up questions that demonstrated he was genuinely trying to comprehend the scope of what I'd accomplished. Our early dates were simple but thoughtful. Richard would research restaurants that served cuisines I'd mentioned missing from my deployments, or he'd find hiking trails that reminded him of landscapes I'd described from Afghanistan. He was always prepared, always punctual, and always genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions about everything from local politics to international relations. When we'd discuss current events, he'd ask about my perspective as someone who'd actually been involved in military operations rather than just reading about them in newspapers. The proposal at Crystal Lake represented everything I'd found attractive about Richard's personality. He'd planned the entire day around activities he knew I'd enjoy, timing our hike to reach the overlook during the optimal lighting for photography, even researching the wildflower blooming schedule to ensure the meadow would be at its most beautiful. The ring itself was modest but perfectly chosen, a classic solitaire that reflected his understanding of my preference for understated elegance over flashy displays of wealth. When I accepted his proposal, I genuinely believed I was choosing a partner who valued my military experience, respected my intelligence, and wanted to build something meaningful together. Richard had never expressed any discomfort with my background or suggested that I needed to change anything about myself to fit into his vision of our future. He seemed to genuinely admire the person I'd become through military service, and I assumed that admiration would continue throughout our marriage. The early years of our marriage reinforced that impression. Richard supported my decision to use my GI Bill benefits to complete my bachelor's degree, even when it meant I'd be spending evenings and weekends studying instead of focusing entirely on supporting his legal career. He'd quiz me on business concepts, help me prepare for examinations, and celebrate my academic achievements with the same enthusiasm he brought to his own professional victories. When I'd struggle with particularly challenging coursework, he'd offer to help explain legal concepts or review my papers for clarity and organization. Richard's law practice was growing steadily during those early years, but he remained grounded and focused on serving local clients rather than chasing prestigious cases or high-profile clients. He'd handle real estate closings for young families buying their first homes, draft contracts for small business owners, and provide legal guidance for local entrepreneurs trying to navigate regulatory requirements. His clients respected his thoroughness, appreciated his reasonable fees, and often recommended him to friends and family members who needed legal services. When my father's heart attack forced us to confront the future of Mitchell Construction, Richard's response seemed perfectly consistent with the man I'd married. He offered to provide whatever legal assistance might be needed, but he framed it as temporary support rather than permanent involvement. Richard understood that I eventually wanted to take over my father's business, and he presented his legal services as a bridge that would keep the company stable until I was ready to assume leadership responsibilities. The corporate restructuring Richard recommended seemed logical and necessary. Mitchell Construction had been operating as a simple, sole proprietorship for 3 generations, with minimal legal protection and no systematic approach to tax optimization or liability management. Richard explained that modern construction businesses needed more sophisticated legal structures to protect against lawsuits, manage subcontractor relationships, and take advantage of tax benefits that could significantly improve profitability. T2. Transformation from Mitchell Construction to Mitchell Construction Group happened gradually over 18 months, with Richard carefully explaining each step and providing detailed documentation of the benefits these changes would provide. He'd show my father comparative financial statements, demonstrating how similar companies had improved their profit margins through proper corporate structuring. He'd explain how forming separate LLCs for different aspects of the business would protect our personal assets from potential lawsuits while creating opportunities for more efficient tax planning. My father, who'd built his business through hard work and reputation rather than sophisticated financial management, was grateful for Richard's expertise and guidance. Dad had always been more comfortable swinging a hammer than reviewing legal documents, and he genuinely appreciated having a family member who could handle the increasingly complex regulatory requirements that modern construction businesses faced. Richard's willingness to provide these services as a contribution to family welfare rather than charging typical legal fees seemed generous and supportive. The partnership agreement that gave Richard 25% ownership of the restructured company was presented as compensation for his ongoing legal services and a way to ensure his continued commitment to the business's success. Richard explained that having a legal professional as a partner would provide long-term stability and protect against future complications that could arise from regulatory changes or industry evolution. My father saw it as gaining a son-in-law who was genuinely invested in preserving the Mitchell family legacy, while modernizing operations for continued growth. What none of us understood at the time was that Richard was systematically documenting every aspect of Mitchell Construction's operations, identifying inefficiencies and opportunities that could be exploited through strategic reorganization. Every conversation about business operations was simultaneously a consultation session and an intelligence-gathering exercise. Richard was learning how the company really functioned, where the profit centers were located, which relationships were most valuable, and how the entire operation could be restructured to maximize his own influence and control. The acquisition of smaller construction companies that Richard orchestrated was presented as a natural expansion strategy that would allow Mitchell Construction Group to compete more effectively with larger Denver-based firms. Richard had identified several family-owned businesses that were struggling with cash flow problems, regulatory compliance issues, or succession planning challenges. By acquiring these companies, Mitchell Construction Group could gain their client lists, equipment assets, and specialized expertise while providing the struggling owners with retirement security. Each acquisition required complex financing arrangements, legal documentation, and corporate restructuring that went far beyond my father's expertise or comfort level. Richard managed these transactions with impressive efficiency, negotiating terms that seemed beneficial to all parties while ensuring that Mitchell Construction Group gained maximum advantage from each deal. Within 2 years, the company had grown from a local contractor with 12 employees to a regional construction group with over 60 employees and multiple specialized divisions. The growth was impressive and profitable, but it came with a level of complexity that made my father increasingly dependent on Richard's management expertise. Every major decision required legal review, every new contract needed specialized documentation, and every expansion opportunity involved regulatory considerations that only Richard seemed capable of navigating. My father found himself relegated to the role of senior advisor rather than active decision-maker, providing input on technical construction issues, while Richard handled all strategic and financial decisions. Meanwhile, I was completing my MBA coursework, studying advanced business, concepts that I assumed would prepare me to eventually take over the expanded company. Richard would share financial reports and strategic plans with me, explaining how the various divisions functioned and what opportunities existed for future growth. He'd ask for my input on operational efficiency issues, seemingly valuing my military logistics experience and business education background. What I didn't realize was that Richard was systematically ensuring that my eventual involvement in the company would be limited to operational roles rather than strategic leadership. Every corporate structure he'd established, every partnership agreement he'd negotiated, and every expansion decision he'd made was designed to consolidate decision-making authority in his hands, while creating the appearance of preserving the eye. Mitchell family legacy. The hiring of Miranda Walsh was presented as a strategic investment in modernizing the company's marketing approach and establishing a professional brand image that would attract higher-end commercial clients. Richard explained that construction businesses were increasingly competing on the basis of marketing sophistication rather than just technical expertise and competitive pricing. Companies that could effectively communicate their capabilities, maintain strong social media presence, and develop professional relationships with architects and developers would have significant advantages over traditional contractors who relied solely on word-of-mouth referrals. Miranda's background was impressive for someone her age. She'd completed her marketing degree at Colorado State with honors, interned with a Denver advertising agency that specialized in construction and real estate marketing, and developed a portfolio of social media campaigns that had significantly improved brand recognition for several small businesses. Her energy and enthusiasm were immediately apparent, and she seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity to build a marketing program for a growing construction company. Richard's working relationship with Miranda appeared purely professional. During her first year with the company, they'd collaborate on marketing materials, coordinate social media content, and develop promotional strategies that successfully attracted new clients and improved the company's public image. Miranda would attend company meetings and social events with the same professional demeanor she brought to client interactions, maintaining appropriate boundaries while contributing valuable insights about market trends and customer preferences. The change in their relationship was so gradual that I missed the early warning signs completely. Richard began spending more time reviewing marketing materials and discussing promotional strategies, but this seemed like appropriate executive involvement, rather than personal interest. He'd come home excited about new client opportunities that Miranda had identified or innovative marketing approaches that could differentiate Mitchell Construction Group from larger competitors. When Richard started traveling more frequently for business development meetings and marketing conferences, I supported these activities as necessary investments in the company's continued growth. The construction industry was becoming increasingly competitive, and companies that failed to maintain professional marketing presence would inevitably lose market share to more sophisticated competitors. Richard's willingness to personally oversee these efforts demonstrated his commitment to ensuring the company's long-term success. The weekend marketing sessions and evening strategy meetings that became regular features of Richard's schedule seemed like evidence of his dedication rather than signs of an affair. Miranda would stay late at the office to complete social media campaigns, coordinate promotional events, and develop marketing materials that required Richard's approval and input. Their collaboration appeared productive and professional, generating measurable improvements in client acquisition and brand recognition that justified the time investment. But what I was interpreting as professional dedication was actually the foundation for a personal relationship that would eventually become the basis for my systematic elimination from both Richard's life and the business empire he'd built using my family's company as collateral. The hotel. Receipt from the Four Seasons was just the beginning of what would become the most thorough intelligence operation I'd ever conducted, and my military training kicked in immediately. 8 years in Army logistics had taught me that one piece of contradictory evidence usually indicates a much larger pattern of deception, and that successful investigations require systematic documentation rather than emotional confrontation. Instead of storming into Richard's office demanding explanations, I treated this discovery like a potential security breach that required careful analysis before taking any action. My first step was establishing a secure workspace where I could gather and analyze evidence without Richard detecting my investigation. I converted the spare bedroom in our basement into what I privately called my operations center, installing a lockable filing cabinet and setting up a computer system that Richard couldn't access. Every piece of suspicious evidence would be photographed, documented, and cross-referenced with financial records, travel schedules, and business expenses to build a comprehensive picture of what had really been happening during those late nights and weekend trips. The Four Seasons receipt led me to examine our joint credit card statements more carefully, looking for patterns I'd previously dismissed as legitimate business expenses. What I discovered was 18 months of charges that painted a clear picture of an ongoing affair disguised as professional activities. Hotel rooms in Denver, Aspen, and Colorado Springs during weekends when Richard claimed to be attending construction, industry conferences, restaurant charges at intimate establishments during supposed client dinners, where the timing and location made it impossible for the meals to be business-related. The jewelry purchases were particularly damning evidence. A $3,200 charge at Tiffany & Cubber's in Cherry Creek during a Tuesday afternoon, when Richard had told me he was reviewing contracts at the office. A $1,800 purchase at a boutique lingerie store in downtown Denver the day before one of his overnight business trips. Flowers delivered to addresses I didn't recognize, always charged to his business expense account as client appreciation gifts, but sent to residential addresses rather than commercial locations. Each discovery required careful verification to ensure I wasn't misinterpreting legitimate business activities. I started tracking Richard's claimed schedule against actual credit card charges, phone records, and even GPS data from his company vehicle. The pattern that emerged was devastating in its systematic deception. Nearly every supposed business meeting during the past year had involved some element of personal activity that contradicted Richard's explanations to me. The most revealing evidence came from social media surveillance that my military intelligence training had prepared me to conduct effectively. Miranda maintained active Instagram and Facebook accounts that documented her personal life with the kind of detail that made timeline verification simple, while she was careful not to post anything that explicitly revealed her relationship with Richard. The location tags and timestamps on her photos provided a roadmap of their activities together. A photo of Miranda enjoying champagne at the Four Seasons bar, posted at 8:47 p.m. on the same evening as Richard's hotel receipt. Her caption read, "Celebrating new opportunities with someone special," accompanied by heart emojis, posted during the exact time frame when Richard had supposedly been in investor meetings. Another image showed Miranda wearing diamond earrings that perfectly matched the jewelry purchase from Tiffany & Co., taken during a weekend when Richard claimed to be attending a construction conference in Grand Junction. The digital evidence extended beyond social media to include email communications that Richard had been careless enough to leave accessible on our shared computer. While he maintained separate business accounts that I couldn't access, his personal Gmail account automatically synchronized with the desktop computer in his home office. The correspondence I discovered revealed not just an affair, but active planning for a future that explicitly excluded me from both his personal life and professional empire. Email exchanges between Richard and Miranda dating back 14 months showed the evolution of their relationship from professional collaboration to romantic involvement to strategic planning for my elimination. Early messages focused on marketing projects and business development opportunities, but gradually shifted to more personal topics as their working relationship became intimate. By month 6 of their correspondence, they were openly discussing their feelings for each other and speculating about the possibility of being together permanently. The most devastating emails were those from the past 4 months, which revealed that Richard and Miranda had been systematically planning our divorce while maintaining the facade of a happy marriage. They discussed timing strategies, financial considerations, and even specific tactics for minimizing my ability to claim assets or ongoing involvement in Mitchell Construction Group. Richard had shared detailed information about our marriage, my personality, and my likely responses to divorce proceedings, providing Miranda with intelligence she could use to help plan their strategy. One particularly cruel email from Miranda to Richard, dated 6 weeks before my discovery, read, "I can't wait until we don't have to pretend anymore. She's so completely clueless about what's happening right under her nose. Sometimes I almost feel sorry for her. But then I remember that she's had 12 years to appreciate what she has, and she's never really understood your potential. You deserve someone who recognizes your brilliance and supports your ambitions, instead of just taking everything for granted." Richard's response revealed the depth of his psychological preparation for discarding me. Sarah's always been more comfortable taking orders than making decisions. Her military background made her perfect for supporting someone else's vision, but she's never had the entrepreneurial instinct that real success requires. She'll be devastated initially, but ultimately she'll be better off with someone whose ambitions match her own limitations. We're doing everyone a favor by ending this, before it becomes even more difficult. The financial records I accessed revealed that Richard had been using Mitchell Construction Group's resources to fund personal expenses and business ventures that had no connection to our family's company. Corporate credit cards had been used for his romantic getaways with Miranda, his wardrobe upgrades, and even the down payment on a luxury condominium in Denver that was titled solely in his name. These expenditures were disguised as business development expenses, marketing investments, and executive compensation packages that had never been properly authorized by the board of directors. The most devastating discovery was evidence that Richard had been systematically undervaluing Mitchell Construction Group's assets while inflating its liabilities to create artificial financial pressure that justified his increasing authority over business decisions. Equipment that was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars was being depreciated at accelerated rates that bore no relationship to actual market values. Profitable contracts were being structured to minimize reported income, while unprofitable ventures were being pursued specifically to create losses that would justify corporate restructuring. Richard had also been manipulating the company's debt structure to increase his control over operations, while creating legal mechanisms for forcing my father out of meaningful involvement. Loans that should have been secured by company assets were instead personally guaranteed by my father, creating personal liability that could be used to threaten his financial security if he attempted to challenge Richard's authority. Meanwhile, Richard had been quietly securing his own financial position through corporate structures that protected his personal assets while exposing my father to maximum risk. The acquisition strategy that had transformed Mitchell Construction from a local company into a regional construction group was revealed to be a systematic asset-stripping operation disguised as business expansion. Each smaller company that had been acquired brought valuable client relationships, equipment assets, and specialized expertise that were then redistributed among the various subsidiary LLCs in ways that concentrated the most profitable elements under Richard's direct control while leaving the acquired companies as hollow shells with minimal value. The former owners of these acquired companies had been promised ongoing involvement in operations and profit-sharing arrangements that were gradually being eliminated through corporate restructuring and contract modifications. Several of these business owners had contacted my father expressing concerns about broken promises and changed terms, but Richard had convinced my father that these complaints were simply natural resistance to modernization and professional management practices. Miranda's role in this financial manipulation was more extensive than I'd initially understood. Her marketing background included significant knowledge of corporate communications and financial reporting that she'd been using to help Richard obscure the true scope of his wealth transfer activities. She'd been creating marketing materials and public communications that presented Mitchell Construction Group's growth and success in ways that supported Richard's narrative while concealing the underlying asset redistribution that was actually occurring. The business plan I'd discovered in Richard's email drafts revealed that their post-divorce strategy included selling off the most valuable assets of Mitchell Construction Group to shell companies that Richard controlled through complex partnership arrangements. These transactions would provide immediate cash flow for Richard and Miranda's new life together, while leaving the original company as a depleted entity with minimal value for my father or me to claim during divorce proceedings. Their financial projections assumed that by the time divorce proceedings were complete, Mitchell Construction Group would appear to be a struggling business with significant debt obligations and limited growth prospects. The valuable assets, profitable contracts, and growth opportunities would have been transferred to new entities that Richard controlled independently, making them legally separate from marital property subject to division during divorce. The timeline. For implementing this asset stripping strategy was coordinated with Richard's divorce planning to ensure maximum benefit for him, while minimizing my ability to claim compensation for wealth that had been built using my family's business as the foundation. Every major corporate decision over the past 18 months had been designed to facilitate this wealth transfer, while creating legal complications that would make it difficult for me to trace or recover assets that were rightfully mine. But the most shocking discovery was evidence that Richard had been forging my father's signature on corporate documents for over a year, authorizing transactions and agreements that my father had never seen or approved. Bank signature cards, loan applications, contract modifications, and partnership agreements all contained forged signatures that gave Richard authority to make decisions that should have required my father's explicit consent. The forgery was sophisticated, enough to pass casual inspection, but comparing the signatures to documents I knew my father had actually signed revealed subtle differences in pen pressure, letter formation, and signing rhythm that indicated systematic document fraud. Richard had apparently been practicing my father's signature and had developed sufficient skill to create convincing forgeries that would satisfy bank officials and business partners who weren't looking for evidence of fraud. These forged documents had been used to authorize millions of dollars in financial transactions, corporate reorganizations, and strategic decisions that had fundamentally altered the ownership and control structure of Mitchell Construction Group. My father's apparent consent to these changes was entirely fabricated, but the legal impact was real and potentially devastating to any attempt to challenge Richard's authority or reclaim family control over the business. The scope of Richard's document fraud extended to tax filings, regulatory reports, and financial statements that had been submitted to government agencies and business partners over the past 2 years. These documents contained false information about corporate ownership, financial performance, and business operations that could expose my father to criminal liability for tax evasion and financial fraud, even though he'd had no knowledge of or involvement in creating the false reports. Richard had essentially created a legal framework that would allow him to destroy my father financially while eliminating any possibility of successful legal challenges to his authority. If my father attempted to expose the fraud or reclaim control of his company, Richard could claim that all documentation had been properly authorized and that any challenges represented an attempt to avoid responsibility for business decisions that my father had apparently approved through his signatures. On corporate documents, the criminal dimensions of Richard's activities were staggering, but they also revealed the most important weakness in his apparently invincible position. His entire strategy depended on maintaining the facade that all corporate changes had been legitimate business decisions made with proper authorization. If I could prove that the authorizations were fraudulent, the entire structure of ownership and control that Richard had established would collapse, potentially leaving him facing criminal charges while restoring my family's rightful position. But proving document fraud would require expert analysis, extensive legal proceedings, and resources that might take years to assemble and deploy effectively. Richard and Miranda were planning to complete their asset stripping operation within months, leaving my father and me with a depleted company and massive legal bills while they enjoyed the wealth they'd stolen from our family business. What I needed was a strategy that would not only stop their theft, but also ensure that I gained control over the business empire they'd built using our family's company as collateral. The solution would require accessing resources and capabilities that Richard had never suspected I possessed, and implementing a counteroffensive that would catch him completely unprepared for the level of sophisticated financial warfare he was about to face. The key to victory lay in understanding that Richard's greatest strength, his assumption that I was financially naive and legally powerless, was also his greatest vulnerability. He'd spent so much energy focusing on eliminating my involvement in Mitchell Construction Group that he'd never investigated what other assets or advantages I might have access to independently of our marriage or my family's business. That oversight was about to prove catastrophic for everything he thought he'd accomplished. The solution to Richard's systematic theft came from an unexpected source that he'd never bothered to investigate during his years of planning my elimination. While he'd been focused on manipulating corporate structures and forging documents to steal my family's business, he'd completely overlooked the financial assets I'd been building independently through my military service and post-discharge investments. Richard's assumption that I was financially dependent on our marriage was about to prove catastrophically wrong. My military career had provided me with benefits and investment opportunities that civilians rarely understood or appreciated. 8 years of active duty, including multiple combat deployments, had generated substantial hazard pay, combat exclusion, benefits, and deployment savings that I'd invested systematically throughout my service. While Richard had been building his legal career, I'd been contributing maximum amounts to thrift savings plan accounts, building a diversified investment portfolio, and taking advantage of military-specific financial programs that offered exceptional returns for disciplined investors. The combat pay exclusions alone had allowed me to save nearly $180,000 during my deployments, money that was completely tax-free and had been invested in aggressive growth funds during some of the strongest market performance in decades. My TSP account had grown to over $400,000 by the time I separated from service, and I'd continued contributing to similar investment vehicles throughout my civilian career, using the financial discipline that military service had instilled. But the most significant asset Richard had never discovered was the veteran-owned small business I'd established during my final year of active duty. Mitchell Defense Solutions had been created initially as a consulting firm providing logistics expertise to defense contractors and government agencies, but it had evolved into a sophisticated investment vehicle that specialized in acquiring distressed businesses and implementing the kind of systematic operational improvements that my military training had prepared me to execute. The business had been deliberately structured to maintain a low profile while building substantial assets and capabilities. Most of the work was conducted through subcontracting arrangements and consulting agreements that didn't require extensive marketing or public visibility. Government contracts and defense industry relationships provided steady revenue streams, while I developed the expertise and resources necessary for larger acquisition opportunities. Mitchell Defense Solutions had generated over $2.3 million in revenue during the past 3 years, with profit margins that reflected the efficiency and systematic approach I brought to every project. The company's client base included defense contractors who needed logistics expertise, government agencies requiring operational efficiency analysis, and private companies seeking to improve supply chain management. Each project had added to both my financial resources and my understanding of how complex organizations could be restructured for maximum effectiveness. The investment portfolio I'd built through Mitchell Defense Solutions was specifically designed for opportunities like the one Richard had unknowingly created. While he'd been manipulating corporate structures to steal my family's business, I'd been building the financial resources and legal framework necessary to acquire businesses and implement the kind of strategic restructuring that could reverse his theft while placing me in a position of absolute control. The key insight that would enable my counteroffensive came from analyzing Richard's corporate structure with the same systematic approach I'd used for military logistics operations. Every weakness in his legal framework, every assumption he'd made about my capabilities, and every vulnerability in his financial position could be exploited using the resources and expertise I'd developed independently of our marriage. Richard had structured Mitchell Construction Group as a complex web of subsidiary LLCs and partnership agreements specifically to prevent any single individual from gaining control over the entire operation. But his legal framework contained a critical flaw that my business education and military training allowed me to identify. The parent company that held controlling interests in all subsidiaries was technically available for acquisition by any entity with sufficient capital and legal sophistication to navigate the purchase process. Mitchell Construction Group Holdings, the umbrella corporation that Richard had established to control all subsidiary operations, was structured as a private company with shares that could be purchased by qualified investors. Richard owned 45% of the holdings company through various trusts and corporate entities. My father retained 30% through arrangements that Richard had been systematically undermining, and the remaining 25% was held by a consortium of small investors who had provided capital for various expansion projects. The small investors who held the remaining shares were primarily retired construction workers, former clients, and local business owners who had been offered equity stakes in exchange for capital contributions or business relationships. Most of these investors had minimal understanding of corporate finance and had never been actively involved in management decisions. Their shares were technically voting shares, but they'd never exercised any meaningful control over business operations. Richard had assumed that these minority shareholders would never organize to challenge his authority or interfere with his plans for complete control. He'd treated them as passive investors who were satisfied with modest dividend payments and had no interest in operational involvement. This assumption created the opportunity I needed to gain control over the entire corporate structure he'd built, using my family's business as the foundation. My strategy was elegantly simple: acquire enough shares from the minority investors to gain voting control over Mitchell Construction Group holdings, then use that control to reverse every corporate manipulation Richard had implemented, while placing myself in position to recover all assets he'd stolen from my family. The minority shareholders represented exactly the voting percentage I needed to achieve majority control, and their limited understanding of corporate finance meant they would likely be willing to sell their shares at reasonable prices if approached by a credible buyer. Mitchell Defense Solutions provided the perfect vehicle for this acquisition strategy. As an established business with substantial financial resources and a track record of successful operations, the company could approach the minority shareholders as a legitimate investor interested in expanding into construction industry operations. The acquisition could be structured as a straightforward business investment rather than a hostile takeover, reducing the likelihood that Richard would detect the threat until it was too late to counter effectively. The financial resources required for this acquisition were substantial but well within the capabilities I'd built through my military service and business operations. The minority shareholders collectively held 25% of Mitchell Construction Group holdings, which my analysis indicated had a fair market value of approximately $1.8 million, based on the company's assets, revenue streams, and growth prospects. Mitchell Defense Solutions had sufficient capital to complete this purchase, while maintaining adequate reserves for the legal and operational challenges that would follow. But acquiring the shares was only the first step in a comprehensive strategy. That would need to address every aspect of Richard's corporate manipulation, while positioning me for long-term control over the business empire he'd built. The legal framework he'd established contained numerous mechanisms for transferring ownership and control that could be used against him once I achieved voting control over the parent company. The partnership agreements and corporate structures that Richard had designed to prevent my family from challenging his authority could be reversed through the same legal mechanisms he'd used to implement them originally. Voting control over Mitchell Construction Group holdings would provide the authority to modify subsidiary structures, replace management personnel, and restructure financial arrangements in ways that would restore my family's rightful position, while eliminating Richard's ability to continue his theft. The forged documents and fraudulent financial reports that Richard had used to support his corporate manipulation would become evidence of criminal activity that could be reported to appropriate authorities once I had sufficient control to protect my father from potential legal retaliation. The systematic nature of the document fraud would likely result in criminal charges that could lead to Richard's imprisonment, while providing additional legal grounds for recovering stolen assets. Miranda's involvement in the financial manipulation would also be exposed once I gained access to corporate records and communications that Richard had assumed would remain secret. Her knowledge of the fraud and active participation in planning the asset stripping operation would make her liable for both criminal prosecution and civil damages that could recover additional resources for rebuilding the legitimate business operations. The timeline for implementing this acquisition strategy needed to be coordinated with Richard's divorce planning to ensure maximum impact while preventing him from detecting the threat and implementing countermeasures. My investigation had revealed that he planned to initiate divorce proceedings within 6 weeks, immediately after completing a major commercial development project that would provide substantial cash flow for the company. This timeline provided a narrow window for completing the share acquisition and gaining voting control before he could restructure the corporate framework to prevent my intervention. The approach to minority shareholders needed to be carefully orchestrated to avoid alerting Richard while ensuring that enough investors would be willing to sell their shares to provide the voting control I required. Each shareholder would need to be contacted individually, presented with a compelling but non-threatening investment opportunity, and convinced to complete the transaction quickly enough to prevent word from reaching Richard before the acquisition was complete. My military training in operational security and strategic planning provided the framework for managing this complex acquisition process while maintaining the secrecy necessary for success. Every contact with potential sellers, every financial transaction, and every legal document would need to be structured to avoid detection while building toward the moment when I could reveal my position and begin implementing the corporate restructuring that would reverse Richard's theft. The psychological impact of this reversal would be as devastating to Richard as the financial consequences. His entire strategy had been based on the assumption that I was too naive, too dependent, and too limited in resources to mount any meaningful resistance to his plans. Discovering that I had systematically outmaneuvered him using superior financial resources and strategic thinking would shatter his confidence while exposing the fundamental weakness of his position. The beauty of this approach was that it would use Richard's own legal framework against him, turning every corporate structure he'd established into a mechanism for his own destruction. The same partnership agreements, subsidiary relationships, and ownership structures that he'd designed to steal my family's business would become the tools for recovering our assets while placing him in a position where he could be held accountable for every fraudulent transaction and forged document. The acquisition of voting control over Mitchell Construction Group Holdings would transform me from a victim of Richard's financial manipulation into the controlling shareholder of the business empire he'd built using stolen assets. The hunter would become the hunted, and Richard would discover that underestimating a decorated Army logistics officer had been the fatal error that would cost him everything he thought he'd accomplished. The acquisition of Mitchell Construction Group Holdings required precision timing and absolute operational security that would have impressed my former commanding officers in Afghanistan. Over the next 3 weeks, I executed what was essentially a covert corporate raid using skills that the Army had spent years teaching me about resource coordination, intelligence gathering, and strategic execution under hostile conditions. Richard had no idea that while he was finalizing his divorce strategy with Miranda, I was systematically purchasing voting control over everything he thought he owned. My first target was Harold Brennan, a 73-year-old retired electrician who had invested $85,000 in Mitchell Construction Group when Richard was acquiring smaller companies during the expansion phase. Harold owned 4% of the holding company and had been receiving modest quarterly dividend checks that supplemented his Social Security income. I approached him through Mitchell Defense Solutions, presenting the acquisition as a straightforward business transaction, where a growing defense contractor wanted to diversify into construction industry investments. Harold was immediately receptive to my offer, which represented a 30% premium over the book value of his shares, plus a guaranteed consulting contract that would provide ongoing income for his electrical expertise. From his perspective, he was selling to a successful business owner who appreciated his knowledge and wanted to maintain a relationship that honored his contributions to the company's success. The transaction was completed within a week, with Harold expressing gratitude for the respectful way he'd been treated compared to the minimal attention he'd received from Richard over the past 2 years. The second acquisition was more complex, involving Maria Santos, a former client who had received shares in exchange for providing prime commercial real estate for one of Richard's development projects. Maria owned 6% of the holding company, but had become increasingly frustrated with Richard's communication style and his tendency to make major decisions without consulting investors who had contributed significant assets to the company's growth. Her shares were technically worth more than Harold's, but she was dealing with family medical expenses that made immediate cash flow more valuable than long-term investment returns. Maria's transaction required careful structuring to address tax implications and family financial planning considerations that went beyond simple share purchase agreements. I worked with Margaret Whitmore's law firm to create a transaction that provided Maria with immediate cash flow while establishing a trust arrangement that would provide ongoing income for her grandchildren's education expenses. The deal took 10 days to complete, but resulted in Maria becoming an enthusiastic advocate for Mitchell Defense Solutions and my approach to honoring investor relationships. The third major acquisition involved convincing 3 former employees who had received shares as part of profit-sharing arrangements to sell their combined 8% stake in the company. These shareholders were more emotionally invested in Mitchell Construction Group's success and more personally loyal to my father, which required a different approach that emphasized my military background and commitment to preserving the company's values while implementing professional management practices that would ensure long-term growth. James Crawford, Rebecca Martinez, and Tom Wilson had all worked for my father for over 15 years and had received their shares during the period when Richard was implementing employee ownership programs that were designed to reduce labor costs while creating the appearance of sharing company profits. These employees had genuine affection for my father and considerable expertise in construction operations, but they'd become increasingly uncomfortable with Richard's management style and his tendency to treat long-term employees as expendable resources rather than valuable team members. My approach to these shareholders emphasized continuity rather than change, presenting the acquisition as a way to ensure that employee ownership and family values would be preserved under new leadership that understood and respected the company's history. I spent considerable time with each of them, discussing their concerns about Richard's direction for the company and their hopes for maintaining the kind of workplace culture that had made Mitchell Construction a respected employer in the local community. The negotiations with these employee shareholders required 3 weeks to complete, but the conversations provided valuable intelligence about Richard's recent behavior and employee morale issues that I hadn't been aware of previously. Apparently, Richard had been implementing cost-cutting measures and policy changes that were designed to force older employees into retirement while replacing them with younger workers who would be less likely to question his authority or maintain loyalty. To my father's leadership approach, the employee shareholders were ultimately persuaded to sell their shares when I offered them positions as senior advisors to Mitchell Defense Solutions, with compensation packages that were significantly better than their current arrangements under Richard's management. The transaction was structured to close simultaneously with my assumption of voting control, ensuring that these key personnel would be immediately available to help implement operational changes that would restore the company's original culture and values. The final acquisition target was Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a retired engineering professor who had invested $120,000 in Mitchell Construction Group because she believed in supporting local businesses that were implementing innovative construction technologies. Elizabeth owned 7% of the holding company and had been attracted to Richard's presentations about incorporating advanced project management systems and sustainable building practices into traditional construction operations. Dr. Chen represented the most sophisticated investor among the minority shareholders, with extensive knowledge of corporate finance and business valuation that made it impossible to present the acquisition as anything other than what it actually was: a strategic purchase designed to gain control over company operations. Her cooperation required complete transparency about my intentions and my qualifications to provide better leadership than Richard had demonstrated during his tenure as chief executive. The conversation with Dr. Chen lasted 4 hours and covered everything from my military logistics experience to my business education to my specific plans for restructuring Mitchell Construction Group's operations to eliminate the inefficiencies and ethical problems that Richard's management had created. She was particularly interested in my analysis of the company's financial structure and my evidence that Richard had been systematically manipulating corporate assets for personal benefit rather than maximizing shareholder value. Dr. Chen's decision to sell her shares was ultimately based on her conclusion that Richard's leadership represented a threat to her investment that could only be addressed through change in management control. She was impressed by my systematic approach to corporate analysis and my detailed understanding of the legal and financial issues that needed to be addressed to restore the company to sustainable operations. Her transaction was structured as a consulting agreement that would provide Mitchell Defense Solutions with ongoing access to her engineering expertise while giving her a role in overseeing the corporate restructuring process. The cumulative effect of these share acquisitions was to give Mitchell Defense Solutions 25% ownership of Mitchell Construction Group Holdings, which when combined with my father's 30% stake, would provide controlling interest in the parent company and authority to implement comprehensive changes to subsidiary operations and management structure. The total cost of acquiring these shares was $1.7 million, well within Mitchell Defense Solutions' financial capabilities and representing excellent value compared to the assets and revenue potential that would come under my control. But the share acquisitions were only the foundation for a more comprehensive strategy that would need to address Richard's systematic theft while positioning me to rebuild the legitimate business operations that he'd been systematically undermining. Gaining voting control over the holding company would provide the legal authority to investigate corporate records, modify management arrangements, and restructure financial relationships, but implementing these changes would require careful coordination to prevent Richard from destroying evidence or transferring assets before I could secure them. The investigation capabilities that voting control would provide were essential for building the legal case that would eventually expose Richard's document fraud and financial manipulation. Access to corporate bank records, email communications, and internal financial documents would allow me to document the full scope of his theft while building evidence that could support both criminal prosecution and civil recovery actions. The timeline for revealing my position and beginning implementation of corporate changes needed to be coordinated with Richard's divorce planning to maximize psychological impact while preventing him from implementing defensive measures that could protect stolen assets or limit my ability to recover them. My intelligence indicated that he was planning to initiate divorce proceedings within 2 weeks, which meant I needed to complete the final share acquisitions and prepare for immediate action once legal documents were filed. The beauty of this corporate acquisition strategy was that it would reverse Richard's power position completely while using his own legal framework to accomplish the reversal. Every corporate structure he'd established to consolidate his control would become a mechanism for his removal from authority. Every partnership agreement he'd negotiated to benefit himself would be modified to restore fair treatment for other stakeholders. Every financial manipulation he'd implemented would be reversed through the same corporate processes he'd used to implement them originally. The moment Richard filed divorce papers, he would unknowingly trigger a series of corporate changes that would strip him of all authority over Mitchell Construction Group while exposing him to criminal prosecution for the systematic fraud he'd been conducting for years. The divorce he expected to provide him with freedom and financial security would instead become the catalyst for losing everything he'd stolen while facing potential imprisonment for his crimes. The hunter was about to discover he'd been stalked by prey that possessed superior resources, better strategic planning, and the kind of patient determination that could only come from military training in complex operations under hostile conditions. The execution phase of my corporate acquisition required the same meticulous attention to operational security that had kept my supply convoys safe during 3 combat deployments. Every communication with the minority shareholders, every financial transaction, and every legal document had to be structured to avoid detection while building toward the moment when I could reveal my position and begin dismantling Richard's empire from within. The complexity of coordinating multiple simultaneous acquisitions while maintaining absolute secrecy would have been impossible without the systematic approach to mission planning that the Army had drilled into me during 8 years of progressively more challenging assignments. The final share purchase was completed on a Tuesday morning, while Richard was in Denver supposedly meeting with potential commercial development partners. In reality, as his credit card records would later confirm, he was spending the day at a luxury spa with Miranda, celebrating what they believed was the approaching culmination of their systematic theft of my family's business. While they were enjoying couples massage treatments and champagne lunches, I was signing the documents that transferred voting control of Mitchell Construction Group Holdings to Mitchell Defense Solutions. Margaret Whitmore's law firm had prepared all acquisition paperwork with the precision that had made her one of Colorado's most respected corporate attorneys. Every purchase agreement, every transfer document, and every regulatory filing was structured to provide immediate legal authority, while creating ironclad protection against any challenges Richard might attempt once he discovered what had happened. The transactions were legally bulletproof and had been coordinated to close simultaneously, preventing any possibility that partial acquisitions might alert Richard before I achieved full control. The psychological impact of maintaining normal behavior during this acquisition period was more challenging than anything I'd experienced during combat operations. Every morning, I had to greet Richard with the same supportive demeanor I'd maintained throughout our marriage, asking about his business meetings and expressing interest in his strategic plans for company expansion. Every evening, I had to listen to his excited descriptions of upcoming opportunities while knowing that I was systematically acquiring the authority to reverse every manipulation he'd implemented. Richard's confidence during this period was simultaneously impressive and nauseating to observe. He would discuss his plans for Miranda's promotion to marketing director with the casual certainty of someone who believed his authority was unquestionable. He'd describe the corporate restructuring projects they were planning to implement after our divorce with the enthusiasm of a couple planning their dream home. His complete certainty that he controlled every aspect of our shared future made it clear that he'd never considered the possibility that I might possess resources or capabilities that could threaten his carefully constructed plans. The most revealing conversations during this period involved Richard's analysis of what he called my limited options following our divorce. He'd explained to Miranda in phone conversations I could hear through his office door that I would have no choice but to accept whatever settlement terms he offered, because I lacked the financial resources or legal sophistication to mount meaningful resistance. He was particularly confident that my emotional attachment to preserving my father's legacy would make me willing to accept minimal compensation rather than risk extended legal battles that might destroy the company entirely. Richard's assessment of my psychology was both accurate and completely wrong. He correctly understood that I cared more about preserving my family's business than maximizing personal financial gain, but he'd completely misjudged what resources and capabilities I had available for protecting what mattered most to me. His assumption that caring about family legacy was equivalent to weakness and vulnerability was about to prove catastrophically incorrect. The intelligence I gathered during these final weeks revealed that Richard and Miranda had accelerated their timeline for completing the asset-stripping operation they'd been planning. Instead of waiting until after our divorce was finalized, they were implementing immediate changes that would transfer the most valuable corporate assets to shell companies they controlled before I could potentially interfere through legal proceedings. Their strategy was to present me with a company that appeared financially depleted and strategically limited, making any legal challenges seem pointless and expensive. The evidence I collected during this period included email communications between Richard and several shell companies that had been established to receive transferred assets from Mitchell Construction Group subsidiaries. Equipment purchases, contract assignments, and intellectual property transfers were being processed through these entities at below-market rates that represented systematic theft of company resources. The transactions were technically legal because Richard had the apparent authority to approve them, but they constituted clear breaches of fiduciary duty that would support both criminal charges and civil recovery actions. Miranda's involvement in these asset transfers was more extensive than I'd initially understood. Her marketing background included knowledge of intellectual property law and brand management that she was using to help Richard transfer valuable business relationships and competitive advantages to their new corporate entities. The client lists, subcontractor relationships, and industry connections that my father had built over 3 decades were being systematically redirected to companies that Miranda and Richard would control after our divorce. The timeline for these asset transfers was coordinated with Richard's divorce planning to ensure that the most valuable resources would be secured before legal proceedings could impose restrictions on corporate transactions. Richard had scheduled the divorce filing for the following Monday, immediately after completing what he described as the final major equipment purchase that would prepare Mitchell Construction Group for expanded operations. In reality, this purchase represented the transfer of nearly $800,000 in construction equipment to a shell company that Richard and Miranda had established for their post-divorce business operations. My counter-strategy required perfect timing to prevent these final asset transfers while exposing the systematic theft that had been occurring for months. The voting control I'd acquired over Mitchell Construction Group holdings would provide the legal authority to halt unauthorized transactions and investigate corporate records. But implementing these powers would require immediate action once Richard filed divorce papers and revealed his intentions publicly. The weekend before Richard's planned divorce filing, I completed final preparations for what I privately called Operation Corporate Justice. Margaret Whitmore's firm had prepared comprehensive documentation of every suspicious transaction, every forged signature, and every unauthorized asset transfer that Richard had implemented during his systematic theft of my family's business. Corporate governance experts had been retained to provide immediate oversight of Mitchell Construction Group operations once I revealed my position. Forensic accountants had been briefed to begin detailed analysis of financial records that would support both criminal prosecution and civil recovery actions. The psychological preparation for this confrontation required drawing on every resource I'd developed during military service. Combat operations had taught me that success in complex missions required absolute confidence in your preparation, combined with flexibility to adapt when unexpected complications arose. The strategy I'd developed was comprehensive and legally sound, but Richard's response would likely include desperate measures that could create additional challenges requiring immediate tactical adjustments. The night before Richard's planned divorce filing, I sat in my operations center reviewing every document, every financial record, and every piece of evidence that would support the corporate revolution I was about to implement. The scope of Richard's theft was staggering, but the evidence was overwhelming and the legal framework for recovery was solid. Within 24 hours, the man who thought he was about to eliminate me from his life would discover that he'd systematically destroyed his own position while providing me with every tool necessary for his complete downfall. The irony was perfect. Richard had spent years implementing sophisticated legal structures designed to prevent my family from challenging his authority or recovering stolen assets. Those same structures would now provide the mechanisms for his removal from all positions of power while ensuring that every dollar he'd stolen could be traced and recovered through corporate action. The student had not only learned from the master, she had surpassed him using resources and capabilities he'd never bothered to investigate. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of Richard's education in what happened when someone systematically underestimated a decorated Army logistics officer who had spent years preparing for exactly this type of complex operational challenge. The corporate empire Richard had built using my family's business as collateral was about to become the foundation for his own destruction, and he had no idea that his carefully planned victory celebration was actually the prelude to total defeat. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a Colorado spring day that seemed designed for dramatic revelations and life-altering confrontations. Richard woke up early, humming quietly while he prepared for what he believed would be the most important day of his legal career. The day he would finally eliminate me from his life while securing permanent control over the business empire he'd built, using my family's company as his foundation. He dressed with particular care, selecting his most expensive suit and the gold cufflinks I'd given him for our 5th anniversary, apparently finding it amusing to wear symbols of our marriage on the day he planned to destroy it. I maintained my usual morning routine with the disciplined calm that had sustained me through countless pre-mission briefings in Afghanistan. Coffee at Euro 600, review of operational plans, final equipment checks, and mental preparation for the complex series of actions that would unfold once Richard initiated the sequence of events that would trigger his own downfall. Every document was in place, every legal contact was on standby, and every aspect of my counter-strategy had been coordinated to ensure maximum impact when Richard's carefully orchestrated surprise was met with my own devastating revelation. Richard's confidence was absolutely radiant as he prepared to leave for his attorney's office. He kissed my forehead with the patronizing affection of someone saying goodbye to a pet he was planning to abandon, then delivered what I now recognized as his final performance as the caring husband making difficult decisions for everyone's benefit. "I have some important business to handle today," he said, his voice carrying the practiced sincerity that had fooled me for years. "There might be some paperwork delivered here this afternoon. Don't worry about anything. I'll explain everything. Tonight." The paperwork he referenced was the divorce filing that would officially initiate legal proceedings while simultaneously triggering the corporate changes I'd prepared to implement the moment his intentions became public record. Richard had no idea that serving me with divorce papers would activate legal authorities I'd been carefully positioning for weeks, transforming what he expected to be my moment of maximum vulnerability into his moment of complete exposure and financial destruction. After Richard left for his attorney's office, I initiated the first phase of Operation Corporate Justice with a series of phone calls that would begin dismantling his carefully constructed empire before he even realized his position had been compromised. Margaret Whitmore's law firm filed emergency corporate governance documents with Mitchell Construction Group Holdings, exercising the voting control I'd acquired through my share purchases to implement immediate changes in company leadership and operational authority. The first corporate resolution removed Richard Blackwell from all executive positions within Mitchell Construction Group and its subsidiary companies, effective immediately upon filing of personal legal proceedings that might create conflicts of interest with his corporate responsibilities. The resolution was carefully worded to appear routine and protective rather than punitive, using standard corporate governance language that would make it difficult for Richard to challenge through emergency legal proceedings. The second resolution appointed Mitchell Defense Solutions as interim management authority for all corporate operations, pending completion of comprehensive audits that would evaluate the financial and operational status of every subsidiary company. This resolution provided me with immediate access to corporate records, financial accounts, and business operations while establishing legal authority to investigate any irregularities that might be discovered during the audit process. The third resolution suspended all major financial transactions and asset transfers pending completion of the audit process, effectively freezing Richard's ability to complete the final asset stripping operations he'd planned to implement immediately after filing divorce papers. Every equipment purchase, contract assignment, and property transfer that Richard had scheduled for this week was now subject to approval by Mitchell Defense Solutions, giving me veto power over any attempt to remove valuable assets from legitimate corporate control. The beauty of these corporate resolutions was that they used Richard's own legal framework to accomplish his removal from authority. Every provision was based on corporate governance standards that Richard himself had established during his systematic restructuring of my family's business. The same partnership agreements and management protocols that he'd designed to consolidate. His power now provided the mechanisms for his elimination from all positions of influence. By 10:30 a.m., While Richard was meeting with his divorce attorney to finalize the legal documents that would officially initiate our separation, I was meeting with forensic accountants who were beginning comprehensive analysis of Mitchell Construction Group's financial records. The evidence of systematic theft that I'd gathered during my investigation would now be supplemented by professional analysis that could support criminal prosecution and civil recovery actions. The forensic team's preliminary review confirmed that Richard's financial manipulation was even more extensive than my investigation had revealed. Hidden transactions, disguised asset transfers, and unauthorized expenditures totaling over $2.4 million had been processed through various corporate accounts during the past 18 months. The systematic nature of these transactions indicated deliberate fraud, rather than accounting errors or management mistakes. At 11:45 a.m., I received confirmation that Richard had filed divorce papers with Adams County District Court, officially initiating legal proceedings that would make our marital problems part of the public record. The filing triggered automatic notifications to corporate counsel for Mitchell Construction Group Holdings, activating legal protocols that Richard had never expected to be used against him. The divorce filing also triggered the final phase of my corporate strategy, which involved releasing information about management changes and audit findings to employees, clients, and business partners who needed to understand that Mitchell Construction Group was implementing new leadership and operational standards. The communications were carefully crafted to emphasize continuity and improvement rather than crisis and disruption, but they made it clear that significant changes were being implemented immediately. The first indication Richard received that his position had been compromised came at 1:15 p.m. when he attempted to authorize the final equipment transfer that would have moved nearly $800,000 in construction assets to the shell company he'd established with Miranda. The bank officer handling the transaction informed him that corporate authorization protocols had been modified and that all major financial transactions now required approval from Mitchell Defense Solutions before they could be processed. Richard's phone call to Mitchell Construction Group's main office revealed that his executive access to corporate systems had been suspended pending completion of governance reviews that were being conducted by new management authority. His assistant, who had been instructed to redirect all calls to corporate counsel, could only tell him that she'd been advised to refer any questions about management changes to Margaret Whitmore's law firm. The psychological impact of discovering that his corporate authority had been eliminated while he was filing divorce papers must have been devastating for someone who'd spent years planning every detail of this day. Richard had expected to spend the afternoon implementing final asset transfers and preparing for his victory celebration with Miranda. Instead, he was learning that every assumption he'd made about his position and authority had been systematically undermined by forces he hadn't even known existed. By 2:30 p.m., Richard was in full panic mode, making desperate phone calls to corporate attorneys, bank officials, and business partners trying to understand how his carefully constructed empire had been dismantled in a matter of hours. Every conversation revealed additional evidence that his position had been completely reversed, that his authority had been eliminated, and that he was now the subject of investigations rather than the person conducting them. The divorce papers were delivered to our house at 3:45 p.m. by a process server who seemed genuinely sympathetic about serving legal documents on someone whose day was obviously already going poorly. I accepted the papers with the calm dignity that Richard had apparently expected from me, thanking the server politely and assuring him that I understood the legal significance of the documents I was receiving. What Richard didn't know was that I'd been expecting these papers for weeks and had prepared my own legal response that would be filed within hours of receiving his divorce petition. The response would not only contest his grounds for divorce, but would also introduce evidence of systematic financial fraud that would transform divorce proceedings into criminal investigation while exposing every aspect of his theft to public scrutiny. The evening hours brought a cascade of revelations that completed Richard's education in what it felt like to have his entire world systematically destroyed by someone he'd underestimated. Miranda called in tears, having been contacted by corporate investigators who were asking detailed questions about her knowledge of financial irregularities and her involvement in unauthorized business activities. The romantic future they'd been planning was suddenly threatened by potential criminal charges that could result in imprisonment rather than wedding celebrations. Richard's attempts to contact me were increasingly desperate as he began to understand the scope of what had happened to his position. Every phone call revealed additional evidence that his assumptions about my capabilities and resources had been completely wrong, that his systematic underestimation of my intelligence and determination had created the very vulnerabilities that were now being exploited to destroy everything he thought he'd accomplished. The man who had planned to celebrate his victory over me that evening was instead discovering that he'd walked into a trap that had been carefully prepared by someone who possessed superior strategic planning capabilities, more substantial financial resources, and better understanding of corporate warfare than he'd ever suspected. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey he'd been stalking had revealed herself to be a predator who'd been patiently waiting for him to expose his vulnerabilities. The confrontation I'd been preparing for months finally arrived at 7:30 p.m., when Richard burst through our front door with the frantic energy of a man whose entire world had collapsed in a single day. His expensive suit was wrinkled from hours of desperate meetings with attorneys who couldn't explain how his corporate empire had been legally dismantled while he was filing divorce papers. His face was flushed with a combination of rage and panic that I'd never seen before, even during our worst arguments over the past 12 years. The confident predator who'd left that morning to eliminate me from his life had returned as cornered prey who was just beginning to understand the scope of his miscalculation. "What the hell have you done?" Richard shouted, slamming his briefcase onto the kitchen counter with enough force to rattle the coffee mugs I'd carefully arranged for this moment. "My attorneys are telling me that some defense contractor has taken control of Mitchell Construction Group. They're saying I've been removed from all management positions and that there are investigations into corporate irregularities. How is any of this possible?" I looked up from the legal documents I'd been reviewing at our dining room table, maintaining the same calm expression that had sustained me through enemy fire in Afghanistan. The papers spread in front of me included copies of every forged signature, every fraudulent transaction, and every stolen asset that Richard had accumulated during his systematic theft of my family's business. Behind me, displayed on our grandfather clock, were printed copies of the romantic emails between Richard and Miranda that documented their affair and their planning for my elimination. Mitchell Defense Solutions acquired controlling interest in Mitchell Construction Group Holdings 3 weeks ago. I replied with the professional neutrality I'd learned from briefing superior officers on complex logistics operations. As the majority shareholder, we implemented immediate governance changes to protect corporate assets and investigate financial irregularities that had been brought to our attention by concerned minority investors. Richard's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so serious. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to dawning horror as he began to process the implications of what I'd just told him. The woman he'd systematically underestimated for 12 years had outmaneuvered him using corporate warfare tactics that surpassed anything he'd implemented during his theft of my family's business. "Mitchell Defense Solutions?" he stammered, his legal training apparently failing him at the moment when he needed it most. "What the hell is Mitchell Defense Solutions? You don't have the resources or expertise to acquire anything, let alone a multi-million-dollar construction company. This has to be some kind of mistake or fraud that we can challenge through emergency legal proceedings." I stood up slowly, allowing Richard to see the full scope of the evidence I'd assembled against him. Financial records documenting his systematic theft were organized in neat stacks that covered half our dining room table. Email printouts showing his romantic correspondence with Miranda filled a separate folder that was marked with his initials. Corporate documents proving his forgery of my father's signature were arranged chronologically to demonstrate the evolution of his fraud over the past 2 years. Mitchell Defense Solutions is the veteran-owned consulting business I established during my final year of military service, I explained. walking to our kitchen to pour myself a glass of wine with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what was unfolding. The company has generated over $2.3 million in revenue during the past 3 years through defense contracting and business consulting services. More than sufficient capital to acquire the 25% of Mitchell Construction Group holdings. That was necessary to achieve voting control when combined with my father's existing ownership stake. Richard's complexion went ashen as he began to understand that his fundamental assumptions about my financial position and business capabilities had been completely wrong. The woman he'd dismissed as financially dependent and professionally limited had been operating a successful business that generated more annual revenue than his legal practice had ever achieved. His entire strategy for eliminating me had been based on intelligence that was not just incorrect, but catastrophically incomplete. "That's impossible," Richard insisted, but his voice lacked conviction as he processed the evidence that surrounded him. "You never mentioned any business. You never showed me financial statements or discussed client relationships. If you had substantial income, it would have been reflected in our tax filings and financial planning discussions." Mitchell Defense Solutions operates as a separate corporate entity with its own tax identification number and financial reporting requirements, I replied, returning to the dining room with my wine while Richard remained frozen near the kitchen. Counter. Federal privacy regulations for defense contractors require strict compartmentalization of business information, especially for companies that handle classified projects or work with sensitive government agencies. I was never legally authorized to discuss client relationships or financial details, even with family members. The mention of classified projects and government agencies seemed to hit Richard like physical blows, as he realized that his wife of 12 years had been operating in professional spheres that he'd never suspected existed. The military background, he'd dismissed as irrelevant to civilian success, had actually provided access to business opportunities and financial resources that dwarfed anything he'd achieved through his legal career. "The minority shareholders," Richard said slowly, his legal mind beginning to function despite his emotional shock. "Harold Brennan, Maria Santos, the employee group. You contacted them directly and convinced them to sell their stakes to your company. That's how you acquired voting control without triggering notification requirements that would have alerted me to what was happening." Each shareholder was approached professionally by Mitchell Defense Solutions and offered fair market value plus premium compensation for their equity stakes, I confirmed, settling back into my chair to continue reviewing the evidence that would destroy his life. Every transaction was conducted with full legal representation and proper documentation. Margaret Whitmore's firm handled all purchase agreements to ensure complete compliance with corporate governance requirements and securities regulations. Richard's mention of Margaret Whitmore seemed to drain the last of his remaining color, as he realized that one of Colorado's most respected corporate attorneys had been working against him while he'd been implementing his theft of my family's business. The legal expertise he'd counted on to protect his position had been systematically outmaneuvered by professionals who possessed superior knowledge and greater resources. "Margaret Whitmore," Richard repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's been representing you throughout this acquisition process. How long has she known about the corporate irregularities and financial manipulation? How long has she been building a case against me while I thought everything was secure?" "Margaret has been investigating suspicious transactions within Mitchell Construction Group for approximately 6 weeks, I replied, pulling out a thick folder that contained forensic accounting reports and legal analysis that would support both criminal prosecution and civil recovery actions. Her firm's forensic accounting division has documented over $2.4 million in unauthorized asset transfers, fraudulent financial reporting, and systematic theft of corporate resources. The evidence includes forged signatures on loan documents, unauthorized equipment transfers, and manipulation of subsidiary financial statements. Richard's legs seemed to give way as he collapsed into the chair across from me, finally understanding that the evidence I'd assembled was sufficient to destroy not just his corporate position, but his legal career and personal freedom. The systematic, Nature of his theft, combined with the documentary evidence of his planning and implementation, would support criminal charges that could result in substantial prison sentences. The forged signatures, Richard said, his voice hollow with the realization that his most serious crimes had been discovered and documented. How did you know to look for document fraud? The signature analysis would require expert forensic examination and comparison with authenticated samples. I opened another folder that contained enlarged photographs of signature comparisons, expert analysis reports, and timeline documentation that proved systematic forgery over an extended period. My father's actual signatures were obtained from bank records, medical documents, and legal filings that were processed before you began your document fraud. Expert forensic analysis confirmed that 16 corporate documents contain forged signatures that were created to authorize transactions my father never approved. The scope of evidence I was revealing seemed to overwhelm Richard's ability to process information, as he realized that every aspect of his criminal activity had been detected, documented, and prepared for legal action. His assumption that document forgery would be difficult to prove had been based on underestimating both my investigative capabilities and my access to professional resources. Miranda, Richard said suddenly, as if remembering that his affair and business planning had involved an accomplice who was equally vulnerable to criminal prosecution. She doesn't know anything about the financial manipulation. Her involvement was limited to marketing and business development activities. She can't be held responsible for corporate decisions that were made before she joined the company. I pulled out the final folder, which contained email printouts and communication records that documented Miranda's active participation in planning, the asset stripping operation, and her knowledge of the fraudulent activities that had been used to fund their romantic relationship. Miranda's email communications indicate extensive knowledge of unauthorized asset transfers and active participation in planning the systematic theft of corporate resources. Her marketing expertise was used to disguise fraudulent transactions as legitimate business development activities. Richard's attempt to protect Miranda from prosecution revealed the depth of his emotional investment in their relationship, but it also demonstrated that he still didn't understand the comprehensive nature of the investigation that had been conducted against them. Every aspect of their affair, every element of their business planning, and every detail of their systematic theft had been documented with the thoroughness that only comes from military-trained intelligence operations. The divorce filing, Richard said, his voice barely audible as he began to understand that his legal action had triggered the very investigations that would destroy him. Filing divorce papers today activated corporate governance protocols that gave you authority to implement these changes. You've been waiting for me to reveal my intentions so you could use my own actions to trigger your corporate takeover. Your divorce filing provided the legal justification for implementing emergency corporate governance measures to protect company assets from potential conflicts of interest, I confirmed, allowing myself a small smile as Richard finally appreciated the elegance of the trap he'd walked into. The same corporate structures you established to consolidate your power provided the mechanisms for your removal from all positions of authority. Richard sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of his defeat while staring at evidence that would destroy everything he'd worked to achieve during our marriage. The man who'd planned to celebrate his victory over me was instead confronting the reality that he'd systematically destroyed his own position while providing me with every tool necessary for his complete annihilation. What happens now? Richard finally asked, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who already knew the answer but needed to hear it confirmed. Tomorrow morning, Margaret Whitmore's firm will file criminal complaints with the district attorney's office documenting systematic fraud, embezzlement, and document forgery, I replied, closing the folders that contained the evidence of his destruction. Simultaneously, Mitchell Defense Solutions will initiate civil recovery actions to reclaim all stolen assets and pursue damages for the harm caused to legitimate business operations. The hunter had finally realized he'd been systematically stalked by prey that possessed superior capabilities, better resources, and the patience to wait for him to expose every vulnerability before striking with devastating precision. The immediate aftermath of our confrontation unfolded with the systematic precision that Richard should have expected from someone with 8 years of military logistics experience. While he sat in stunned silence at our dining room table, processing the magnitude of his defeat, I was already implementing the final phase of Operation Corporate Justice that would ensure his complete elimination from any position where he could threaten my family's interests or attempt to rebuild the criminal enterprise he'd constructed using our business as collateral. The first call I made was to my father, who deserved to understand what had been happening to his life's work, and how the systematic theft that had been conducted in his name was finally being addressed. Dad's voice carried 3 years of accumulated stress and confusion as he tried to process my explanation of Richard's document forgery, financial manipulation, and corporate fraud. The relief in his voice when he understood that Mitchell Construction would be restored to legitimate family control was worth every dollar I'd invested in acquiring the voting authority necessary to reverse Richard's crimes. "Sarah, I knew something was wrong," Dad said, his voice breaking with emotion as he finally had permission to acknowledge the doubts he'd been suppressing about Richard's management decisions. The business was growing and the profits looked good on paper, but it didn't feel like the company I'd built anymore. Richard always had explanations for every change, and I trusted him because he was family, but I'd started to feel like a stranger in my own business. The conversation with my father revealed the psychological damage that Richard's manipulation had inflicted beyond the financial theft. Dad had spent 3 years questioning his own judgment, wondering if his discomfort with corporate changes reflected his inability to adapt to modern business practices rather than legitimate concerns about ethical violations. Richard's systematic gaslighting had convinced my father that his decades of successful business leadership were somehow inadequate for contemporary construction industry requirements. The second call was to Margaret Whitmore, who confirmed that criminal complaints would be filed with the Adams County District Attorney's Office at 9 a.m. the following morning. The forensic evidence we'd assembled was sufficiently comprehensive to support felony charges for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy that could result in substantial prison sentences if Richard was convicted. The civil recovery actions would be filed simultaneously, seeking damages that would exceed the value of every asset Richard had accumulated during our marriage. Margaret's assessment of our legal position was unequivocally positive. Richard's document forgery was systematic and extensive enough to support federal charges in addition to state crimes, she explained with the satisfaction of an attorney who rarely had such overwhelming evidence to work with. The email communications between Richard and Miranda provide clear evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, and the financial records document systematic theft that will be relatively straightforward to prove in court. The third call was to the employees who had sold me their shares in Mitchell Construction Group Holdings, informing them that their decision to support new management had been validated by discoveries of criminal activity that would have eventually destroyed their investment value and job security. James Crawford, Rebecca Martinez, and Tom Wilson were invited to resume their positions with the restored company under employment terms that would honor their loyalty and expertise, while providing the security that Richard's management had systematically undermined. The relief and gratitude expressed by these longtime employees revealed another dimension of the damage that Richard's criminal enterprise had inflicted on people who had trusted him to preserve the values and relationships that had made Mitchell Construction a respected employer. Their willingness to return to the company under my leadership provided immediate operational stability, while demonstrating that Richard's management approach had been rejected by the people who understood the business most intimately. Richard remained silent throughout these phone calls, apparently overwhelmed by the comprehensive nature of the corporate restructuring that was being implemented while he watched helplessly from our kitchen table. His occasional attempts to interrupt or object were met with polite but firm reminders that he no longer held any authority over Mitchell Construction Group operations, and that his input was neither requested nor legally relevant to the decisions. being made. The fourth call was to Mitchell Defense Solutions Corporate Counsel, authorizing immediate implementation of security protocols that would prevent Richard from accessing corporate facilities, equipment, or records that might be relevant to ongoing criminal investigations. Every company credit card, corporate account, and business relationship that Richard had controlled would be transferred to new management authority within 24 hours, eliminating any possibility that he could attempt to destroy evidence or continue asset-stripping operations. The systematic nature of Richard's elimination from all positions of influence was designed to ensure that he understood the futility of resistance while providing comprehensive protection for the legitimate business interests that needed to be preserved during the transition period. Every corporate relationship, every client account, and every employee arrangement would be evaluated and restructured to eliminate any ongoing connection to Richard's criminal activities. Miranda's position was addressed through a separate but equally decisive process. Corporate security protocols required her immediate suspension from all duties pending completion of criminal investigations, with termination procedures initiated to ensure her permanent removal from any role where she might access confidential business information or influence operational decisions. Her involvement in Richard's systematic theft made her continued employment a liability that could not be tolerated under any circumstances. The criminal complaints that would be filed the following morning included detailed evidence of Miranda's participation in planning and implementing fraudulent asset transfers, making her subject to prosecution as a co-conspirator rather than simply an employee who had been misled by her supervisor. Her romantic relationship with Richard provided additional motivation for her criminal behavior, while eliminating any possibility that she could claim ignorance of the illegal activities she had actively supported. Richard's attempts to contact his own attorney were frustrated by the systematic nature of his isolation from resources and support systems that he'd previously taken for granted. His corporate credit cards had been canceled, his business accounts had been frozen pending investigation, and his professional relationships had been compromised by the criminal charges that would become public record within hours. The man who had controlled substantial resources that morning was discovering what it felt like to face serious legal challenges without adequate financial means to mount effective defense. The divorce proceedings that Richard had initiated that morning were transformed from his planned vehicle for eliminating me into my opportunity to expose every aspect of his criminal behavior through legal discovery processes that would make all evidence available for public scrutiny. The civil litigation that would accompany criminal prosecution would ensure that every dollar Richard had stolen could be traced and recovered while preventing him from hiding assets through bankruptcy or other legal maneuvers. The beauty of this legal strategy was that Richard's own divorce filing had created the jurisdiction and procedural framework necessary for comprehensive asset recovery while exposing his criminal activities to multiple forms of legal action. Every attempt he might make to protect his position would provide additional evidence of his guilt while strengthening the case for maximum criminal penalties and civil damages. The psychological impact of his complete defeat was evident in Richard's physical deterioration as the evening progressed. The confident executive who had left that morning to eliminate me from his life was replaced by a broken man who understood that every assumption he'd made about his position and capabilities had been systematically proven wrong. His underestimation of my intelligence, resources, and determination had created the very vulnerabilities that were now being exploited to destroy everything he'd worked to achieve. The final conversation of the evening involved Richard's desperate attempt to negotiate some form of settlement that might limit his criminal exposure while preserving minimal assets for his survival after prosecution. His offer to return stolen assets in exchange for reduced charges demonstrated that he still didn't understand the comprehensive nature of the evidence against him or the moral impossibility of accepting any arrangement that would allow him to escape accountability for his crimes. There will be no negotiations, no settlements, and no mercy for what you've done to my family, I told him, with the finality that comes from 8 years of military service and 12 years of systematic underestimation. You chose to steal from people who trusted you, forge documents in my father's name, and plan my elimination with the same woman you were conducting an affair with. The consequences you're about to face are exactly what you've earned through your own choices. Richard's final recognition that his position was hopeless came when he realized that I possessed not only the evidence necessary to destroy him, but also the resources and determination to ensure that destruction was complete and permanent. The woman he'd dismissed as financially dependent and professionally limited had systematically outmaneuvered him using capabilities and assets that he'd never suspected existed. The morning headlines in the Denver Business Journal would announce, "The corporate restructuring of Mitchell Construction Group under new leadership that was implementing comprehensive reforms to address financial irregularities discovered during management transition." The afternoon legal filings would reveal the criminal charges against Richard Blackwell and Miranda Walsh for systematic fraud and embezzlement that had been perpetrated against a respected family business. Within 6 months, Richard would be serving a 7-year prison sentence for fraud and conspiracy, while Mitchell Construction Group would be operating under my leadership as one of Colorado's most successful veteran-owned businesses. The company that he'd tried to steal would become the foundation for an enterprise that honored the values and relationships he'd systematically destroyed while building the kind of ethical business practices that create lasting success. The hunter had been completely defeated by prey that revealed superior strategic capabilities, better resource management, and the kind of patient determination that could only come from military training in complex operations. Richard's systematic underestimation of my abilities had provided me with every advantage necessary to reverse his theft, while ensuring that justice was served with the precision and thoroughness that his crimes deserved. 5 years later, I'm standing in the conference room of Mitchell Construction Group's new headquarters in downtown Denver, looking out at the city skyline that now includes 3 buildings we've constructed under my leadership. The company that Richard tried to steal has become Colorado's premier veteran-owned construction firm, with annual revenues exceeding $50 million and a workforce of over 200 employees who share our commitment to integrity and excellence. Richard was released from federal prison last month after serving his full 7-year sentence. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he's working as a paralegal for a small firm in Grand Junction, living in a studio apartment and taking the bus to work. Miranda disappeared entirely after her conviction, reportedly moving to another state to start over with a new identity. Neither of them has attempted to contact me, which is probably the wisest decision they've made in years. My father officially retired 6 months ago, finally able to enjoy his golden years, knowing that his life's work is in capable hands and that the Mitchell family legacy will continue for generations to come. He spends his time fishing, woodworking, and occasionally visiting our job sites to offer advice that I still treasure as much as I did when I was 8 years old and learning to swing a hammer. The lesson I learned through this experience is that underestimating someone can be the most expensive mistake you ever make. When people dismiss your capabilities because of their own prejudices and assumptions, they're essentially handing you every advantage you need to prove them catastrophically wrong. If this story of strategic revenge and corporate justice resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who lived to regret it? Share your own experiences with turning the tables on people who thought they had you figured out. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more incredible stories of ordinary people achieving extraordinary victories through intelligence, determination, and perfect timing. Tomorrow, I have an absolutely wild tale about a teacher who discovered her principal was embezzling funds, and the brilliant way she exposed him using nothing but a yearbook committee and some very creative accounting.